Chairman Hicks, thank you for joining us today. Commissioner Bryson, good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you. Thank you.
We'll wait for others to join in. All right, everyone, I know it's 1:01, but we're going to give a few more minutes for others to join in. Thank you for your patience. Heather King, can you elevate Mitch Cordova to the panel? He's filling in for President Licari today. It's Mitch Cordova. If anyone else here is filling in for a member of the Statutory Review Committee and you are not on the panel, can you please email me at steven.gentile@tn.gov, or if you have my number, text me, and we'll elevate you to the panel. Okay, that said, it's 1:03. Let's go ahead and get started. Jason?
Good afternoon, everybody. Rachel, do you want to go ahead and call the roll now, or do you want to wait a couple of minutes?
I can call roll now.
Okay, if you would, please.
Randy Boyd. Jim Bryson.
Here.
Stephen Gentile.
Here.
Bill Hardgrave.
Here.
Catherine Hare. Gary Hicks.
Here.
Jessica Himes.
Here.
Michael Licari.
Mitch Cordova here for Michael Licari.
Sydney McPhee. Jason Mumpower. I'm sorry, was someone speaking up for Sydney McPhee or Jason Mumpower?
Sorry, Drew Harpwell for Sydney McPhee.
Okay, Drew Harple, thank you. Jason Mumpower? Brian Noland? Bill Oldham?
Here.
Dwayne Tucker?
Here by way of April Robinson.
Thank you. Flora Tidings?
Professor
There
Tidings, you
is-
were on
sorry.
mute there.
Yeah, there is a panelist named, a participant named Flora. Is that Chancellor Tidings?
She's here, but she looks like she's having challenge coming off the mute there. So she is here.
Okay. Bo Watson? Dawn White? Mark White? All right, there are 10 committee members here.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel. Again, good afternoon, Director Gentile, members of the Statutory Committee. Today, we are presenting recommendations for updates to the Tennessee Outcomes-Based Funding Formula for the 2026 through 2030 cycle. These recommendations are the result of a deliberate 5-year process informed by the Statutory Review Committee, institutional and system partners, legislative and state stakeholders, and the priorities outlined in the new statewide higher education master plan. The goal of these recommendations is not to redesign the formula from the ground up, but to sharpen it, to make sure the formula continues to reward the outcomes Tennessee values most, which include timely completion, student success, workforce alignment, and institutional productivity. The proposed changes focus on 4 major areas. First, the formula would move to a 6-year graduation rate from a 6-year graduation rate to an on-time 4-year graduation measure for first-time full-time freshmen, better aligning funding incentives with the state's emphasis on reducing time to degree and improving student affordability. Second, the dual enrollment metric would shift from an unduplicated headcount to completed credit hours, which more accurately recognize the institutional effort required when high school students complete multiple courses. Thirdly, the recommendations remove from awards degrees per 100 FTE metric, which no longer captures activity consistently across sectors, particularly for community colleges serving short-term certificate students. And finally, the workforce investment premium would be updated to better reflect high demand in living wage fields using more precise program level data while allowing consideration of regional workforce needs. Importantly, today's meeting will act as the culmination of this review process and the final opportunity to hear from each of our stakeholders before the Commission votes on this item in July. Taken together, these recommendations preserve the stability and transparency of Tennessee's nationally recognized funding model while improving its alignment with today's student success and workforce priorities. With that being said, I'll turn it over to Julia for her to walk through each of these items. And if you have any questions, just let us know.
Good afternoon, members of the Statutory Review Committee. My name is Julia Arns-Hoffman, and I'm the Director of Fiscal Policy. In that role, I help manage the state's appropriation process and outcomes-based funding formula for THEC. I'm excited to be with you all today, and we have really 3 main goals for our time together. The first is that we would like to talk through the mechanics of the funding formula. We'd then like to go through the proposed methodology for the workforce investment premium. And then finally, as Jason mentioned, this is the final meeting of this body ahead of the Commission's vote on the outcomes-based funding formula. So we'd like to finish up with just talking through our recommendations for the formula. Diving into the funding formula mechanics, a main philosophical question that we've asked ourselves throughout the review of this cycle is whether the formula is working the way it's intended to and the way it ought to, both from the state and institutional perspective. Tennessee higher education is a leader across the nation. Each year, we're consistently ranked at the top for FAFSA completion, enrollment growth, and financial aid provided to students. But a cornerstone to Tennessee achieving these accomplishments and remaining aligned with state priorities is the work of the outcomes-based funding formula. Since its inception in 2011, the formula has remained a critical policy innovation to drive student and institutional success. And a key component of the formula in driving institutional success is that it not only requires institutions to compete against one another for funding, but it also requires them to compete against themselves. The formula asks institutions to ask themselves how they can continuously improve upon each outcome. And in Tennessee, 100% of state appropriations flow through the outcomes-based funding formula. And what that means in practice is that each year, a share of funding is calculated for each campus based on their outcome performance. That share of funding then determines how much of the $1.7 billion of state appropriations each campus receives. There are two funding pools that this occurs through, and you'll see that on this slide. The first funding pool is the new money that's being requested for each fiscal year. Each campus is able to receive a portion of that new money. And for this year's most recent request from this past November, that was $73.8 million. The second pool of money is the redistribution of base funding. So each campus's base funding or their prior appropriations is then redistributed based on their performance in this year's formula. This represents the remaining $1.6 billion appropriated to formula units. And so you'll see this in practice here on this slide, that if we look at, that left institution and they improve their outcomes by 5%, but all other institutions do the same in that year, no change is made to how the funding is distributed. The piece of the pies stay the same for every one of our campuses. But if the same institution improves its outcomes by 5% and all other institutions do not improve their outcomes, that institution gains more funding. And conversely, if the institution improves its outcomes by 5% and all other institutions improve their outcomes by 10%, the institution then loses money or cedes funding towards the other campuses. The formula has been intentionally designed to move money based off of how an institution performs, because the better the outcomes compared against themselves and their peers, the more money flows their way. However, we know that there are some concerns with the effects of the redistribution. While the formula is designed to use a 3-year average to reduce the volatility of the effects of the formula, drastic changes in outcomes do have an effect on campuses. For example, this year for fiscal year 27, the redistribution of funding moved 1.2% of funding, or nearly $18.5 million. We've heard from our campuses that this swing in funding, while distributed largely across the locally governed institutions, makes it difficult to budget efficiently. So THEC has been embarking on conversations with campuses and stakeholders to discuss potential solutions, and I'd like to walk through those with you today. The first is to limit out-of-state students' impact within the formula, as large increases in out-of-state students and international students is a large component of institutional growth. However, in preliminary analyses from THEC, as we looked at the data, we found that removing out-of-state students largely benefited the community college sector, who disproportionately serve in-state students. And so while, our LGIs and other UT campuses outside of Knoxville were feeling those impacts, removing the out-of-state students did not really move the needle to offer a solution here. The next solution that we proposed was to move the formula from a 3-year average to a 4 or 5-year average. However, our analyses found that these only delayed the impacts of the redistribution for campuses to experience later on and did not yet help with the predictability. The bottom 3 changes that I'm going to cover are really recommendations that are more philosophical in nature as to how the formula should work. The first is to develop a separate funding pool or separate funding pools for institutions to pull from. Likely, this would be done using Carnegie classifications based off of an institution's research activity. So for example, the University of Tennessee, Knoxville and University of Memphis would be in one category based on their high research activity. Our staff have a couple of concerns related to this methodology. The first is that by creating these pools of funding, it freezes appropriations in this moment in time. So since UTK and Memphis would be in their own bucket, the next bucket would include the remaining 5 LGIs, and they would be competing for a tighter pool of money than maybe some of their other peers, since this has been a better budget year for UTK and for University of Memphis. Secondly, introducing multiple funding pools in the formula may increase uncertainty during difficult budget years. If appropriations were to decline in the state, it could be possible that some funding pools may not receive new appropriations at all, and there may be additional discrepancies. The second recommendation is to adjust the weighting structure within the formula. And I apologize, I have to move forward a little bit on my slides. In the current structure, institutional leaders are given the opportunity to rank outcomes based on their institutional missions and priorities at the beginning of each 5-year cycle. You'll see this here on the left side of an example institution that has ranked their institutions from highest priority to lowest priority. THEC staff then work to develop the final weights using some internal processes and derived caps to ensure that no campus is allowed to put too much or too little emphasis on a given outcome or outcome category. For example, it wouldn't be in the state's best interest if we allowed our community colleges to rank associate degrees as 0% of their weighting and workforce training as 100% of their weighting. We want to strike a balance between institutional mission and the alignment of statewide goals. Adjusting this process would allow our campuses to have additional flexibility in how their ranking translates from those numbers into the weighting structure within the formula. The last solution is one that came up during a convening with our chief financial officers of our campuses. It would be to create a soft hold harmless policy that would allow institutions to have a year to adjust to lower appropriations before actually receiving less money in their budgets. This proposal is the largest philosophical change in the principle of how the formula operates, but we understand that, that we need to balance prioritizing outcomes and student and institutional success with also ensuring our institutions have stable enough budgets to remain fiscally responsible. I'll pause here for any questions or comments related to the redistribution and some of the solutions our staff have proposed.
Julia, I'll go first here. I'm gonna go back up to the changes within the formula. I want to reemphasize that these were the changes that have been discussed before. Came up in our conversation with CFOs about, if UT Knoxville is growing in enrollment primarily off the backs of out-of-state students, not primarily, but that's where the big shift is happening. Could that lead to a resolution here? But in truth, out-of-state enrollment has been increasing nearly all of our universities. And that's why that did not come through here as a solution. Down in the changes in formula principles, you mentioned the separate funding pools, and you gave an example of UT Knoxville, University of Memphis being in one pool versus others and the limitations there. I think the limitations with a separate funding pool, the biggest concern, and this came up about 10 years ago when we were discussing this for community colleges, is that you give a decision point that is, no matter how you divvy up those pools, a decision point that maybe we'll fund this pool of institutions more than that pool. And it can come down to less outcomes and more who's got the better argument to make on which pool should be funded more so. And that's been the bigger concern that I've had with going that direction.
Stephen, I had 2 questions actually. One was, first of all, what consideration has been given to as we increase some of these? So for example, student success, retention. If you have 90% retention, moving the needle is very, very difficult. And so we talked about, is there a threshold that we consider acceptable? And so funding comes along with exceeding that threshold. And have you even thought about that? That's one question. And question number 2, if THEC goes back and says, okay, here's the weights that you've suggested, this doesn't seem consistent with what we think it should be, and this is probably, I probably get shot for saying this, but is there is there value in THEC running their analysis and say, based on our analysis, this is what we see, and have campuses then adjust accordingly. And that way you don't get people making kind of less data informed decisions, and they still have a way to weigh in and still can change that as a negotiation process, but there's a starting point.
I'll turn to Julia to answer the first question, and then I'll pepper in.
Absolutely. So regarding your first question on retention rates, and I know that was a conversation we had during the first meeting of this body. Our staff are really hesitant to include rates in the formula only because, as you mentioned, it's really difficult to improve those rates. And so one of the things that we've heard with, where we were with a 6-year graduation rate is that it's actually very difficult once you get very successful at it to move the needle. And so it really caps the ability for institutions to be able to continue prioritizing that and feeling the effects, the positive effects of that work.
Okay, I jumped in a little late, so I missed that the rates weren't going to be included. So I was just hopeful that that was considered.
Okay. And the second question about the weights, the give and take with the institution. I mean, we have not done that in the past. Or we ask for the prioritized ranking order, and then based on mission profiles and other understandings of the intended purposes of campuses, use that to create the weights. But as far as a solution to this element here, which again, the what we're trying to address here is the concern that's come from many of our institutions about UT Knoxville's growth and others' decline. If there are any way that we could, like, I've heard Dr. Noland refer to ETSU as an access-oriented institution in talking about this concern. Could a greater weight on progression metrics help be a release valve here? At the end of the day, I don't think it will change that much in the final appropriations, but it's something to consider on the table. Because to boil it down here, my biggest concern is that I don't think that there is a fix to the issue issue that's come up within the formula itself. I think it's an issue to be considered outside of the data and how there was something put on the table by a CFO about that soft hold harmless, giving a year to go down to the new base appropriation. There are other funding streams that we have for capital maintenance, capital outlay. Could we consider that as a solution in how we distribute funding? But within the formula itself, I do not see one, and we've tried to address the issue that actually does it with the outcomes themselves.
Hey, this is Bill Hargrave. Where certainly each school and University of Memphis would be in there would like to see the formula change to benefit them. Certainly separate funding pool, as you mentioned, for R1s or others. But it really would be selfish, because at the end of the day, this formula has worked for this state for a very long time, and I'm hesitant to start chasing changes to the formula, because once you do, you never stop chasing it. And where we all don't like it, because it can impact us one way or the other on any given year because of the changes in student progression or headcount or whatever. I think the formula for the most part is a really good formula, and maybe tweaking it is appropriate, but I'd really be hesitant to make significant changes. And some of these I would qualify as significant changes. And I know that they're to kind of soften the blow of some of these budget changes, but at the end of the day, at least for us, we know what the formula is, so we can already project out, what that is going to look like because of the 3-year average. So we have a pretty good sense of what it's going to look like, assuming that the pie stays relatively the same or increases a little bit.
I appreciate those comments, President Hargrave, and I'll just add, some of our CFOs that are on the call know this, but our team here at THEC in fiscal policy are dedicated to helping you all kind of think through what those budget projections can look like. And I know we've been working on some modeling that we're hoping to implement as well with this new iteration of the formula.
And I'll just add one thing just very quickly, Stephen, because you mentioned it. I do think it's worth mentioning because I know there's several folks have talked about limiting that out-of-state student impact. Look, in a time of declining enrollment nationwide, we are going to have to rely upon bringing in more out-of-state students to grow our workforce. And because we all know the more out-of-state students that we can bring in here, that's the way, they're going to, the majority of them are going to stay here in the state. That's the way we grow our workforce. And so I would hate to see us limit that simply because I know we're going to have to continue to do that. And we know every other state in the country is going to try to do the same thing, right? They're going to be trying to attract, and some states may even be putting incentives on attracting out of state. So I would certainly hate to put a disincentive on attracting out of state students.
Thank you, President Hargrave. And that, in the initial iteration of this formula 15 years ago, there was, we did limit the out-of-state student impact, and that exact argument you just gave was a reason why we removed that impact, to get more people to come here and stay here.
Stephen, real quick, as a part of the conversation with holding institutions harmless, was there any discussion around potentially, so if an institution didn't progress and their funds were going to be redistributed to other institutions, that 1 year, that they would actually have 1 year of improvement. If they showed improvement, they wouldn't lose their funding. But if they, after that 1 year, they didn't improve or didn't create a plan, then they would actually lose some of that funding. So in essence, given that 1 year to figure it out, get back up to where we need to be. And if you can't, then you potentially lose funding.
I'll ask fiscal policy team to correct me where I'm wrong, but my understanding of it was that it wasn't exactly that. It was, the funding formula said you should go from 100 million down to 95 million, a 5% decline. And then you wouldn't feel that decline the very next year. You'd feel that gradually over time, and not to have a change in that outcome based on how you perform the next year.
That's correct, Stephen. You would still feel the effects, but from a budgetary standpoint, you would have a year to plan for those effects. Well, our staff, remains committed to continuing to explore these options and continue these discussions with presidents, CFOs, and any other stakeholders that have ideas. But for the sake of time, I will go ahead and transition us to our next item on the agenda, which is the proposed methodology for the workforce investment premium. I do want to start us off with a quick note that since our team sent out the memo to you all a couple weeks ago, we received feedback that there could be greater alignment in our proposed methodology to the state's workforce Pell efforts and the need to remain agile with new programs in demand across the state. And so I'm going to turn it over to Stone to share more detail about the methodology and how our staff has aimed to address those limitations, and look forward to hearing your feedback as well.
Thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, committee members. As Julia said, my name is Stone Watson. I'm the fiscal policy analyst here at THEC, and I'll be giving an overview of the proposed changes we've been working on for the workforce investment premium. To set the stage, during the last formula review cycle, the workforce investment premium was added to the formula as a focus population. THEC used a broad definition that encompassed a STEM plus healthcare framework, and you'll see those zip codes on the slide right now. This premium has applied to any student who has completed an undergraduate award that includes short and long-term certificates at community colleges, associate's degrees, and bachelor's degrees. Since the inception of this premium in 2022, we have been asked by stakeholders how this premium can better align with state and regional workforce needs. Next slide, Julia. As we began this journey about a year ago, THEC staff were empowered by this committee to look into what it would look like to update the workforce investment premium. A working group was convened of institutional, system, and state stakeholders to learn more about the value and measurements of inputs and outputs of a workforce premium from the UT Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research. Additionally, the working group highlighted the need for an updated workforce investment premium to consider regional workforce needs that fall outside the statewide needs. With this feedback and information, THEC staff partnered with the University of Tennessee Boyd Center to examine whether linking academic zip codes to labor market outcomes can inform the next iteration of this premium. The analysis also draws from the State Collaborative on Reforming Education, or SCORES, impact credential framework, and adds alignment with the state's workforce Pell initiatives, like Julia mentioned earlier. Throughout our conversations, there was a common theme of ensuring the new workforce investment premium included an alignment to high needs fields that meet or exceed a baseline wage threshold. This wage floor serves as a common reference point across the proposed metrics, ensuring that identified programs not only respond to the labor market demand, but also lead to earnings that support long-term economic mobility. Incorporating wage also aligns with other areas of THEC's work, like the supply and demand report. As with the original workforce investment premium, we are proposing streamlining all zip codes under this updated definition to be applied to all institutions and all undergraduate credential levels. The first part of our proposed methodology for the workforce investment premium is the impact credential framework, and you'll see that on the left-hand part of this slide. The framework uses 2017 completions data from TN Data to build a statewide picture of post-secondary programs by combining awards that share the same 4-digit zip code and award level across institutions, focusing on bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees, and community college certificates. Each program was flagged based on whether its 2-digit zip code aligned with one of the state's 9 high needs areas in the current OBF formula, and was then categorized into an impact level. Impact levels were assigned by evaluating Tennessee's job outlook projections between 2022 and 2032, alongside median earnings 5 years after graduation, which were adjusted to 2024 dollars using the Consumer Price Index before being compared to the MIT living wage thresholds. And you'll see these different thresholds on the left side of the chart: 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, with their respective wage thresholds and job projection thresholds. These indicators were ultimately mapped into the 3-star structure framework that you see that organizes credentials based on labor market demand and wage outcomes. However, to align this methodology with the goal to make the formula more streamlined, THEC staff proposed a non-tiered framework that includes all programs that had graduates in 2017 that had median earnings 5 years after completion of at least $43,196 and a job outlook growth of at least 0.8% between 2022 and 2032. With any framework comes limitations. With this framework, there is no wage data for out-of-state students. Without wage data for out-of-state students, earnings outcomes may be understated because the analysis only reflects the wages of students who remain in Tennessee's workforce. Programs that attract many out-of-state students may appear to have lower or incomplete earnings outcomes simply because a portion of graduates are not captured in the data. This gap limits the ability to fully assess the impact of an academic program. Second, there is limited scope of academic programs due to the inclusion of wage data. The wage metric causes us to look back in time to 2017 for us to look at median earnings data 5 years post-completion. So eligible programs for the proposed premium are limited to those with graduates in 2017. Also, the metric excludes in-demand fields with low wages and emerging fields. With these limitations in mind, our team is continuing to consider ways to improve this metric in the future. Our policy planning and research team here at THEC has partners with the US Census Bureau on a pilot project called the Post-Secondary Employment Outcomes, or PSEO, that would allow us to better understand out-of-state student wages and better align data with academic programs. While this data is not available in time for this review cycle, THEC staff remain committed to exploring its use in future iterations of the formula. Another piece of our proposed methodology is to consider the changing federal financial aid landscape, specifically workforce Pell. On this slide, you will see the requirements for programs to be workforce Pell eligible. These workforce Pell eligible programs will impact what community college credentials would be included in the workforce investment premium. THEC's Academic Affairs and Workforce Alignment Bureau are working with the Tennessee Department of Labor and other stakeholders to compile a list of programs that would be eligible. The idea for this piece of the puzzle for the workforce investment premium is to include programs that become workforce Pell eligible and to add them to the list of programs from the impact credential framework I just discussed earlier. Including these programs will allow us to align the premium with high demand jobs, especially in fields where short-term training is the primary route. To bring us back to the big picture, THEC staff propose a workforce investment premium methodology that includes a living wage, in-demand fields, and any programs that eventually become workforce Pell eligible. However, THEC staff want to propose one more addition to this methodology that would allow institutions to be rewarded for being agile to changing needs in their service areas. Alongside the already discussed proposed methodology, THEC staff propose an institutional nomination process that will give campuses the opportunity to nominate some academic programs. This will allow for institutions to advocate for programs that meet a regional workforce need or seeing more student interest and academic programs that become newly approved by THEC. This process will align closely to THEC's academic program approval process and request adequate data and narrative to explain why an academic program should be included in the workforce investment premium. Additionally, if approved, the academic program will apply to all institutions and all credential levels to ensure consistent implementation of the proposed premium. This would be an annual process to create a workforce investment premium that is agile to the changing workforce landscape in our state. The last slide for this gives an overview of all the items I have talked about. Something to highlight is that THEC staff propose only adding programs through the workforce Pell and institutional nomination process on an annual basis, and the high needs field plus living wage programs will be assessed during the next 5-year review cycle. Additionally, no programs will be taken off of this list until the next 5-year cycle to ensure campuses have the time to respond to this premium. This workforce investment premium proposal is more practical, responsive, and grounded in what's actually happening in Tennessee's workforce. By pulling in living wage data, in-demand fields, workforce Pell eligibility, and an institutional nomination process, we're creating a model that can adapt as needs change without losing consistency or transparency. Our hope with this is that this approach gives institutions the flexibility to highlight what's happening on the ground in their regions while still keeping the statewide goals in focus. I'm happy to answer any questions about this proposed workforce investment premium. Thank you.
I'll just follow on quickly. Stone, thank you for that. A couple of things. First of all, to recap, when we created this measure 4 years ago, we knew we were putting together a definition that we wanted to revisit this cycle. It was, again, STEM plus healthcare, out of convenience of the crunch time to make that. It was aligned to our quality assurance funding measure of that same high need field. That has since changed, allowing us to open the door to reconsideration. What I like about this approach is that there have been things that have popped up over time that has people scratching their heads that have not been included in our current metric. For instance, it's well known that we have a great K-12 educator need or social worker need. This new definition captures both of those as zip codes, whereas STEM plus healthcare did not. The complicating part about having institutional nominations for academic programs, that's coming from a recognition that there are places that we need to go here in Tennessee over the next 5-10 years that have not been captured in salary data, wage data. Nuclear comes to mind, and also quantum has been one that's come to mind as well. We want to be able to make sure that institutions that are investing in those high need fields are able to make the case for their inclusion in this formula, whereas looking backwards in time would not necessarily provide that for us. And I'll pause there. Okay.
Yeah, if there's no additional questions about this premium, I'll toss it back over to Julia to provide an overview of all the proposed changes to the outcomes-based funding formula.
Thanks, Stone. Thanks, Stephen. So as we mentioned, we will be going before the commission in a few weeks to give the final proposal of recommendations for the outcomes-based funding formula. We have 4 items that we will be taking to them that are being recommended. The first is the shift from 6-year graduation rate to 4-year graduation rate in the university sector, which is now also statutorily required for THEC. The second is to eliminate the awards and degrees per 100 FTE. So that would be a loss in outcome in both for the community college and the university sector. The third is to revise the dual enrollment metric to capture FTE rather than the head count right now, which would more accurately address the number of credit hours that are being taken in the dual enrollment space. And then the final one will be today's recommendation from Stone, which is to update the workforce investment premium. You'll recall that there are a number of items that we've discussed as a body that may not have been on that list. And so THEC staff are not currently recommending them. The first is changing the adult learner premium wage, which was proposed to change from 25 to 23. This is on the basis of some analyses that change would actually benefit our university sector at a larger rate than it would our community colleges, when the request came from the community colleges to more accurately address their student population. The second was a conversation on whether or not we needed to update our focus population weighting structure at all. We've run analyses with some partner organizations and found that the current weights most adequately address the stackability of those different focus population premiums. And so we're recommending to keep them the same. The third item is developing a transfer student focused population premium. You may recall we talked about this during the first meeting. Given that there wasn't a ton of interest from this body to move forward that premium, alongside giving our team more time to think through what this premium could look like to incentivize transfer and how to incorporate our TTP process, we've decided to hold on to that one for future cycle reviews. Fourth is including secondary student hours in workforce training, which is really due to a limitation of data. And the final conversation that we had was streamlining progression outcomes. And you all gave us the feedback that right now they're really quite easy to understand and they're important milestones for our students as they continue on their academic journey. I'll pause here to see if there are any questions on the recommendations of what we are and are not moving forward before I talk about our final steps together as a committee. Great. So you all have seen this timeline a number of times, and we've alluded to it several times during today's meeting. But pending approval from the commission during our July meeting, we will then work with our campuses to develop those institutional weights and also to release the institutional academic program nominations that were outlined in the workforce investment premium. And the formula will be used this fall for the fiscal year 28 appropriation cycle. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for your thought partnership and support throughout this process. Coming off the heels of the master plan, we had a lot to discuss to think about the future of this formula and what it could look like and how it could drive forward both student and institutional success. And we appreciate the time and effort that you've given our team. Stephen, I'll pause there to see if you have any last words for this committee before we adjourn.
I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today and over the last, 8 months or so. We will be talking about this with our commission in a month from now. But of course, if you have any thoughts or concerns, you can always reach out to me and we can talk more about it too. Thank you. All right. Have an excellent day, everybody.